Hey everybody, I'm Riley. It's nice to finally show you my face after a long semester of interacting. So, to start this presentation, I want you to close your eyes and picture a scene. It's a courtroom. And in front of the courtroom, you've got the jurors who are sitting there, attentive, listening to a prosecutor. Prosecutor's thundering away at someone. The accused is sitting quietly, waiting for his fate. Judge is presiding over. The crime is a capital one. It's murder, treason, espionage, something of that nature. And it's the drama of that moment that I want you to think about. There's something within the Western mind that makes capital punishment a particularly engaging topic to talk about. There's the drama of it playing out in the courtroom. There's the execution as it actually happens, the appeals, the possible midnight reprieve. And it got me thinking, how did we arrive at this conclusion? How do we, as a society that nominally supports human rights, the concept of due process, arrive at the conclusion that lethal punishment is sometimes necessary? Well, because it's such a huge issue worldwide, and particularly in the West, in the United States, I decided to write my paper looking at two different perspectives and how they differ and compare and contrast with each other in their view of capital punishment. So this paper is going to analyze the Kantian theory of capital punishment as well as the utilitarian theory of capital punishment. And we're going to try to explore a little bit what it means to subscribe to both of these belief systems in relation, and also how does that work? Do they agree with each other? Do they not? What conclusions can we draw that can help us make a more educated opinion about whether or not we should engage in capital punishment? So let's start. So when we look at both of the reason that I picked Kant and utilitarianism is because both of them have been enormously influential within the Western school of thought. Both of them commented pretty extensively about capital punishment. And most of the arguments that we use today to support capital punishment, or at least the people who support it use, are ultimately derived from one of the two. So we'll start with Kant. Kant, as you know, is a German thinker. He comes at a point in history where capital punishment is used pretty extensively. So through the course of my research, I was able to first find out the most important thing to know about Kant's relationship with the death penalty is, one, he's totally for it. He thinks it's good to go. It's a great policy to take with people who commit murder and treason. He's mostly focused on murder. He really only kind of alludes to the idea that treason is also justified for its use because treason is the murder of your country, if you will. The reason that Kant is so interested, when I was going through, I initially believed Kant would be very much opposed to capital punishment. I thought of his relationship to the categorical imperative. I thought of the idea of never using people as a means to an end, but as an end in and of themselves. And I thought that's really bizarre that this guy is going to try to say that we should be executing people, right? It feels to me like that is using people as the ultimate mean. But as it turns out, Kant is very strongly focused on retributivist policy. So he very strongly believes that if you believe, as he does, that the government has an obligation to ensure that the rights and freedoms and protection of the citizens that it controls are upheld, then the obligation to punish criminals becomes necessary. It's not something the government can ever choose not to do. They have to do it. So if you take that one step further, Kant is willing to go out on a limb and say, I actually think that you need to punish criminals to the utmost extent possible in the identical way that their crime was committed. So what does this mean? So Kant he's not saying he understands that reality doesn't really work like that, right? If a thief steals $1 million, you can't steal $1 million from a thief to make it right. But you want to get as close as possible. So for a thief, he might have to perform some type of labor that can make that up. And for a murderer, they have to be put to death. Kant is really kind of bizarre in this sense because he really doesn't explain how that comes at odds with the categorical imperative. Instead, he tries to use something called the equality principle to justify this. He says, basically, by applying punishment fairly and uniformly in crimes where we have to try to match this eye for an eye, lex talionis, as it's called, model, capital punishment becomes a necessity of the state to employ. And Kant is not interested in the benefit to the state at all. He's not interested in the benefit to citizens at all from capital punishment, or any other punishment for that matter. Instead, he's interested in the moralistic end result for the person who is being executed. It's the ultimate equality of action. So, in a way, this is kind of something that we in the West today view as a rather primitive way to look at capital punishment, I believe, because retribution, people will often talk about retribution, vengeance, not really used, though, by policymakers as a justification in any meaningful sense for the use of lethal measures by a state. So I think that it's important to understand that this was a popular opinion, and it did frame the way that we look at punishment. I know, for me personally, I do believe that criminals should be punished if they've done something heinous. I'm not certain about capital punishment yet. We'll get to that later. But I think that it's interesting that Kant kind of paints this framework for us to follow. So looking further on, the next you've got the utilitarian thinkers as well. And when it comes to the utilitarian thinkers, you've got Bentham and Mill. So when it comes to Bentham, who comes first, I was pretty certain that Bentham was going to be very pro-capital punishment. And it turns out, once again, I was completely wrong. Bentham's actually totally against capital punishment. And as you might expect, it's because he doesn't see that it's bringing a lot of utility to any type of situation within the criminal justice realm. Bentham believes that convict labor is actually going to be a much more cost-effective, cost-efficient means to employ criminals after they've been convicted of any crime. He doesn't see that executing people is going to be worthwhile to the state in terms of what it benefits, the deterrent effect not going to be significant enough to justify it. And furthermore, he also, interestingly, says, I don't know if in the scheme of utility, how we're going to reconcile the fact that innocent people are sometimes executed, right? When an innocent person's executed, the utility of the situation, not good. It's definitely a very deleterious act on the behalf of the state. It lessens respect for rule of law. It has a lot of negative effects. Excuse me. So that was kind of his position on it. Now later, Mill, who kind of evolves the utilitarian beliefs within the 19th century, Mill is actually completely different. He views capital punishment as a very efficacious system. And it's interesting to look at his justification for it because he sees it as actually less inhumane than a life of imprisonment or hard labor, which he doesn't believe it's possible that murderers can ever be dealt with in any way other than being executed or being subject to hard labor. He also believes that capital punishment has an immediacy of effect. And by this, he really alludes to, well, if you are a murderer or a would-be murderer, seeing somebody executed is a lot more frightening and jarring and could make you rethink your actions than the threat of being put in prison. And so he does see a very strong deterrent effect from that. And as for Bentham, he does address the idea that Bentham puts forward that it's potentially going to result in innocent people being killed by basically saying, well, I'm not really worried about that. I think the justice system's actually got so many safeguards in it, probably never going to be a problem. Which, as we know today, not true, not accurate. There's plenty of examples of people who were executed who probably did not commit a crime. And those types of miscarriage of justice are exactly what Bentham was worried about, something that Mill was much more comfortable with. I think that Mill he doesn't say this, but he kind of alludes to the idea that even if that were to happen, it would be in such a small number that it would not have a net overall negative effect on the entire enterprise of capital punishment. So, where does this leave us for conclusions? Well, I believe that Kant's strongest argument comes from his application of the equality principle. Kant is using the equality principle to say, hey, I believe very strongly that criminals need to be punished. They need to be done uniformly. these the punishment has to try to fit the crime as best as we can. If we can't do it, we'll try to do it symbolically. So with Kant, it's kind of that kind of brings to the weakness of his argument as well as, well, Kant also explicitly said, for example, well, you can't rape a rapist, right? That's a violative, that's wrong, right? Inherently wrong. But executing a person's totally okay if they commit murder. And I would say there's some questionable logic there. I think that I agree with him that raping a rapist is wrong, but I think that if you use that, there's really no reason why executing a person is right in that context. I also think that one thing to consider that really kind of made me think Kant had a little bit of a stronger argument is his was actually a moderating argument when he made it. At the time that he was writing, execution was used as a punishment for almost every crime. Especially in Germany, there was a whole list: stealing horses, hunting the wrong person's game. These could all be punishable by death. So Kant actually saying we should only be using this for treason and for murder is a little bit of a stabilizing, moderating force. So just something that I thought was really interesting from the result of that. As far as the utilitarian argument, one of the issues is that utilitarian arguments, both Mill and Bentham, their arguments all depend on the idea of the utility of the act, right? So when it comes to something like capital punishment, you are going to be forced to try to come up with the most comprehensive list possible of pros and cons of a specific action to try to evaluate whether it's worthwhile. And the issue with that is, with capital punishment, we can look at the data so many different ways. You could argue that it's a strength that utilitarian theory in general tries to do something that could at least theoretically be examined in a scientific way, or a statistical way, if you were to find statistics on how effective capital punishment was, for example. But the reality is, I found two articles, both from the Stanford Law Review, one of which alleged that the government has a moral imperative to execute people because certain statistical evidence suggests that 18 murders are prevented for every execution performed, which the authors were pretty convincing. It was a very well done piece, only to be refuted by another article from the Stanford Law Review, which was written as a counterpoint, basically providing their own statistics that were completely the opposite. So I think that one of the issues is that it's very, very ambiguous as to what the reality of the utility of the action actually is. And also another problem, Mill also talks about, when he's discussing why he thinks capital punishment is less inhumane than life imprisonment, he says, well, dying really isn't that bad. We're all going to do it. Speeding up the process is a little inhumane, but not nearly so much as to make capital punishment not worthwhile to do. To which I say, well, if death really isn't that bad, or the worst thing, as he kind of alludes to, then why is it such a severe punishment? I think that there was faulty logic in both pieces in conclusion. I think that the conversation may have to be something that we have to explore in a totally different way. Both of these theoretical frameworks have merit, but they also have enough flaws where it leads me to believe that they don't provide the best context to decide if capital punishment is good or not. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that you will provide your own thoughts about capital punishment and whether or not you think there's a moral imperative for the government to punish. Thank you very much, and it's been a great semester talking to you.